Hello and welcome. I'm excited for this video. We're talking about my favorite show of all time, Deep Space Nine, Star Trek, Deep Space Nine. So what happens when Star Trek doesn't get to fly away from its problems? Develop a much deeper show that respects continuity and builds storylines, has excellent serialization, remains character-driven throughout. It is a wonderful and often underappreciated watch. Even if you know Trek, it is easy to overlook some of what we'll cover here, which is the videos that you should watch to prepare yourself for Deep Space Nine if you haven't seen the series, if you haven't seen any Star Trek for a long time. If this is your first Trek series ever, we're going to first do a completely spoiler-free list, then a spoiler warning, then we will justify the list and open it up for more discussion. Our list begins with the original series. This will be either Season 1, Episode 26 or 27, depending on what you're watching it from and whether it counts The Cage, which was originally an unaired pilot but has since kind of been stuck in as the first episode of the series. From Season 2, Episode 4, Mirror Mirror, 15, The Trouble with Tribbles, and Season 3, Episode 7, Day of the Dove. That is it for the original series. Star Trek The Next Generation, Star Trek's first live-action television return. There were two animated seasons, and the first movie or two, I think the first two movies that came out at this point. But for the plain old television, Star Trek The Next Generation, we start with Season 1, Episode 20, Heart of Glory. Season 2, Episode 16, Q Who? Episode 20, The Emissary. Episode 17, Sins of the Father. We include 19, Captain's Holiday. If this isn't your thing, if you're in a rush, skip it. You will see why it's relevant to Deep Space Nine, but it's relevant to one single episode of Deep Space Nine. It's not relevant at all to the series as a whole. The same is true for Menage a Troi, although there are more episodes. This is Season 3, Episode 24, Menage a Troi. It's not essential. If you don't like it, turn it off. Season 3 finale, Best of Both Worlds, and Season 4 premiere because it was a two-parter. Family, Season 4, Episode 2. This is not essential, but I would highly recommend it. Season 4, Episode 7, Reunion. 11, Data's Day, and 12, The Wounded, the only two in a row on the list other than two-parters. See Episode 20 of Season 4, Cupid. This is another one that's optional. And the Season 4 finale, Redemption. Season 4 premiere, also Redemption. And Episode 3 of Season 5, Ensign Row. Now, at this point, you're ready to begin Deep Space Nine. Not watch all of it, but begin and watch Emissary and Past Prologue, which are the first two episodes. If desired, if you want to continue with the Next Generation watch list, you can also do that. Season 5, Episode 5, Disaster. And then as soon as you watch that, you're not going to be spoiled or miss anything of however much you watch the first two seasons of the Next Generation. And then continue with the Next Generation watch list. It was kind of a necessity for them as far as a production standpoint. They were limited on how much crossover and interconnected storytelling they could do because Deep Space Nine was syndicated and aired at different days and times in different areas. But continuing with the Next Generation watch list, Season 6, Episode 10, Chain of Command. Episode 24 of Season 6, Second Chances. Season 7, Episode 20, Journey's End is another non-essential if you don't like it. This does have relevance to something that comes up over and over again on Deep Space Nine, but Deep Space Nine does introduce what you need to know on its own terms. Season 7, Episode 24, Preemptive Strike. And that is the entire list, and we're going to show a card that has the entire list for reference if you'd like it. It has asterisks on all of those that we said were skippable if desired. And now, the spoiler warning. So we're going to get into the plot details and the relevance of all of this to DS9. Deep Space Nine is a different kind of show. It builds on a lot of storylines that were seeded through the Next Generation. You have Chief O'Brien, who started out as a nameless side character, actually, in the pilot of the Next Generation, and was developed more and more. Those Season 4 episodes, The Wounded and Data's Day, both feature O'Brien heavily. for him to go on to become a main character on Deep Space Nine. And then later in Deep Space Nine series, after the Next Generation had wrapped up, Worf comes over to Deep Space Nine. Cardassians, Bajorans, Klingons, Maquis, everything that sets these things up in the original series and the Next Generation is relevant for Deep Space Nine. Errand of Mercy, which was our first on the list for the original Star Trek, that's the first appearance of the Klingons. It is interesting to watch this also for setup to the Next Generation, because they even tease, or they say in the original series, that one day there will be peace with the Klingons. The Next Generation, Gene Roddenberry, I believe it was his creation actually, for the Klingons to be at a peace treaty with the humans in the Next Generation at the start. It paid off what that set up from the original Star Trek. Mirror, Mirror. If you're familiar with Deep Space Nine, you know that Deep Space Nine does wonderful returns to the Mirror universe. So the direct sequels to this episode of the original series. The trouble with Tribbles, you know exactly why this is on the list. Also, of course, if you're a fan of Deep Space Nine already. But if you don't remember, this also introduces a Klingon character who appears in the second season of Deep Space Nine on a story with Dax. I don't remember the name of the episode. But all three of these Klingon episodes of the original Star Trek, that introduces a Klingon character who returns in that Deep Space Nine episode. So it's actually a really special episode, but it wasn't executed all that well to be a very memorable episode. But it's cool if you're familiar with these episodes from the original series and you know what they were doing on Deep Space Nine when they brought these characters back, if you can remember their names, because they look entirely different, because they did update their look and makeup for the Next Generation era. Day of the Dove, its primary purpose, honestly, is to introduce that character. But of course, it continues the Klingon backstory, so all of that's relevant. There's a lot of Klingon homework for this, even though the other factions are more important. It's the Klingons that are set up more previously in the franchise to Deep Space Nine. That's what Heart of Glory is. Q-Who, Season 2. This actually is the most essential. This and Best of Both Worlds are the most essential to start Deep Space Nine, because it's the Borg story with Captain Picard and being captured by the Borg. Those are huge spoilers. For one thing, it actually spoils the Next Generation if you watch Emissary before you watch the Next Generation. The Emissary is continuing with the Klingon stuff, and you would lose a drinking game for every time I have mentioned Klingon, so we will keep going. Sins of the Father, continuing. Captain's Holiday. There is, of course, this is only relevant to one episode of Deep Space Nine, so that's why it's skippable. It's one season, one episode. It's not known to be the best. It has a few moments. Menage a Troi. Laxmana Tori is just a divisive character, so if you want to skip her episodes altogether, that's an option. It also does, though, build on the Ferengi. That is also relevant to Deep Space Nine. It's the beginning of kind of a reinvention of the Ferengi to an extent, although this still has a little bit of the Next Generation's original version of the Ferengi that was just kind of abandoned to kind of fix them as a species and to use them, to make much better use of them within the overall scope. Star Trek has plenty of villains, and the Ferengi were never going to cut it to actually be alongside the Romulans and the Klingons, or the Borg, or later the other guys that I won't spoil if you haven't seen DS9. So we've already discussed the Best of Both Worlds. Family is on this list really just to enhance your experience of watching the scenes between Picard and Sisko. That's why I recommend it. And it really makes those scenes more interesting, enriched. It's great television. Reunion, continuing the Klingon stuff. Data's Day. This is O'Brien being set up more as a character, as is the Wounded. And the Wounded is also the introduction to the Cardassians. Cupid, this is where it has a few fun moments. Yes, you will know why it's relevant to Deep Space Nine. It's just not essential if you don't want to watch it. But there's a few good moments in this episode for sure. Redemption, continuing the Klingons. Ensign Ro, this introduces the Bajorans. So this is significant for sure. It introduces Ro Laren, who originally was going to be a main character on Deep Space Nine, but the actors didn't want it. The character of Kira Nerys was created. I think Ensign Ro would have been very cool to see on Deep Space Nine, but I really love what we got. I think Kira was always a great character throughout. There's some fans who don't like her, at least in the first couple of seasons. I think that Kira Nerys really hit the ground running. Dax was the one who took a little time to get running, but she did. She definitely got there. And some of that was also just Bashir being a creep. Bashir took a while to get running. I digress. Disaster. There is a reason why this is placed the way it is on the list, because it's the birth of Molly, and Molly doesn't appear until the third episode of Deep Space Nine. Chain of Command. This is another Cardassian story, and it's also one of my favorites of the entire Next Generation series. Second Chances. This I just won't spoil, even now. Journey's End. It's one of the lesser episodes of the Next Generation, frankly. It does have the relevance with the Maquis and its story there and their setup. I believe they were actually already introduced on Deep Space Nine before Journey's End aired. I believe there is a Maquis story in the earlier part of the second season of Deep Space Nine. So maybe the original air date of Deep Space Nine will vary by region. So in some places, maybe Journey's End came first, but for the most part, yes. I mean, earlier in the second season of Deep Space Nine. Preemptor Strike continues the Maquis story, and that's the list. So I appreciate you watching this far, and let me know if I missed anything. Would you like to hear what episodes to skip of Deep Space Nine? I'll tell you one, Sanctuary. I just don't like that one at all. Even that one has a few good moments. There's very few bad episodes of Deep Space Nine. You're not really initiated into Deep Space Nine until you watch the absolute cinema that is Move Along Home. I will leave you with that. Thank you.